Hello, my name's Eric Ford. I'd like to talk about implementing electronic lab order entry management systems in hospitals. This is a study of U.S. hospitals who have been adopting a new electronic medical record application related to lab orders. My name is Eric Ford. My co-authors are Dr. Timothy Huerta and Mark Thompson from Texas Tech University and William F. Ford from Middle Tennessee State. I'm recording this for the GITMA World Conference being held in Bangalore, India. I wish I could be there with you, and I apologize for not appearing in person. And I'd like to thank my colleague Nir Shetry for agreeing to field some of the questions and help facilitate your viewing of this lecture. The purpose of our study is to assess the impact of electronic lab order entry adoption on hospitals' productivity, efficiency, and change management features. The U.S. healthcare system is undergoing a major renovation of its health IT information technology infrastructure. In some ways, we would say that this is our version of Y2K. And why is this necessary? Well, there's lots of medical errors in the United States healthcare system that are attributed to information management issues, in particular flows. There's also significant cost issues with respect to electronic lab order entry. Duplication and unnecessary ordering of tests has been attributed with millions of dollars in excess cost. What causes this? Well, some of the studies have found that physicians are unable to access results in a timely fashion, and rather than go through the effort of hunting up that earlier lab, they'll simply reorder the lab. Or a patient will move from one facility, for example, an ambulatory facility, to a hospital, and although they may have a test that's timely enough to be used, the hospital will simply go ahead and order a new test. And this actually occurs even within hospitals. If you're admitted to the emergency room, they may run a test, and then if they discharge you out into the hospital, not really discharged from the hospital, but move you to a medical surgical unit, they will often reorder the same test even though they've ordered it within the same facility. So there's lots of unnecessary testing. And why does this matter? Well, laboratory results and the way that labs are gathered impacts everything in a hospital. For example, think about the simple lab order entry process. A physician writes the order, often then hands it to a nurse or a secretary on the unit who then processes it. The nursing staff is then charged with carrying out getting the patient to the lab or having the lab technicians come to the patient, and this requires a lot of movement of patients, which creates something called a handoff. And if you're familiar with medical errors, handoffs are where a lot of errors occur because there's confusion about what's going on with the patient. Information isn't passed from one caregiver to the next, etc. So these labs really trigger a cascade of events that touches on almost every hospital activity, and therefore they can impact productivity across the facility in fairly dramatic ways. So why use IT to address laboratory results? Well, these are really amenable to information technology in an automated format, particularly web-based and those sorts of applications. Physicians love to get results to their phones, their electronic phones, to computers that are readily available, etc. It also causes increased systemization. So, as you may know, many drugs, for example, go by different names. Even lab orders can be idiosyncratically referred to among physicians depending on their specialty, etc. Having the system automated actually takes a lot of that variance out of the system, and reducing the variance for those of you who do quality assurance sort of stuff is usually the first step to improved quality. The technologies have been demonstrated to be cost effective, and they also serve as the basis for larger electronic health records, EHRs, that include other aspects of the patient experience, including things like diagnoses, medication management and reconciliation, etc. The other big movement that's occurred in the United States in the past 5 years is something called meaningful use. We recently had a major piece of legislation passed at the federal level, meaning it affects the entire United States. And part of that legislation included the meaningful use of health information technologies. And chief among these were eLabs, or electronic laboratory order entry. The federal government knows that a lot of money is being wasted here, and essentially eliminating waste is the biggest form of savings that can occur. So what have we done? Well, we looked at several years worth of data and developed a taxonomy of eLab system adoption rates. In other words, comparing year to year, how does adoption change? Then we measured hospitals' efficiency, and this is their technical efficiency, technological change, and productivity. All of this is done using something called a Malmquist analysis, which is a form of linear programming or data envelopment analysis, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. So then we took our taxonomy and compared it to these productivity measures, efficiency and technological change, and saw what impact different forms of implementing an eLab had on productivity. We drew our data from the American Hospital Association, the AHA, and they'd been running a special series in their annual survey that asked, are you routinely using lab orders in your system? And they had it parsed out into 5 different rates: 0%, 1 to 24%, 25 to 49, 50 to 74, and 75 to 100. And so what we did is look at how those changed across years to create a taxonomy to measure the rate of change in effect. Here you see a table that shows these rate of change. On the horizontal axis you have 2008, and on the vertical axis 2007 for the same measure. So what you get on the diagonals is no use, and we indicate NA, meaning it's not applicable. These hospitals have no electronic lab order entry. If you look at 0 to 24% and its intersection in those 2 years, you'll see no change. That's what NC stands for. So on the diagonal you have no change, no change, no change. We did differentiate among the no change types because if you have a major implementation, in other words, you're already using it, we should see that impacting your productivity. A lot of the activity in terms of what we're looking for in the analysis occurs above the diagonal. And you'll see the blue square has SI. This means this is a simple implementation. In other words, they went from no use to 0 to 24. And this is sort of a beta testing mode if you want to think about it that way. Continuing along the no use horizontal column, you'll see that we have 3 cells in red labeled BB. This is the Big Bang. And what's happening here? This is going from 0 to 50, as we say in the United States. It's a car reference, how fast we're driving. But this is where you really jumped in with both feet and implemented the system in a major way, and we call it the Big Bang. You'll notice on the off diagonal, one group over, I have a set of purple cells labeled IP. This is incremental progress. And what does that mean? That means you moved from 0 to 24 to 25 to 49, or from 25 to 49 to 50 to 74%. Essentially, you moved one cell to the right. We refer to that as incremental progress. If you jumped 2 cells but were already engaged, we called that major progress, MP, and that's noted in the yellow. I'm not going to spend too much time on below the no change diagonal, but I will say there were hospitals that actually backed up. In other words, they reduced the number of labs that they were processing as an overall percent, and we did capture that in our data as well. So what is efficiency or productivity? Well, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, AHRQ, which is the major quality and efficiency measuring organization in the U.S. government, they define efficiency as an attribute of performance that is measured by examining the relationship between 2 products of healthcare, essentially inputs and outputs. And that's what we do here. You can see that data envelopment as an analytic strategy differs from linear regression. Linear regression, you're essentially looking for the average of what's happening within the cloud of dots, versus if you think about this cloud of dots, we look for what happens at the frontier. This is also referred to as frontier analysis in some circles. And then what happens is the people who are on the efficiency frontier, in other words, they're getting the maximum output for every unit of input, they're defining efficiency, they're the frontier. Everybody who's below that line is by definition inefficient. And we actually go ahead and measure that inefficiency as part of the data envelopment, which is essentially a linear programming tool. And it's called the Malmquist analysis. For those of you who wish to look into the literature a little more closely, you can see how it's done. The other nice thing about the Malmquist measure of productivity is we can decompose total factor productivity, TFP, into its constituent parts, which are efficiency change, and this is a latent construct of efficiency, and it's what we call the management effect, and technological change. And this is really what happens to organizational processes. So how is the model specified? Well, for inputs, we took licensed beds, the number of staff, and non-licensed staff. So what are we really looking at? In classic productivity, you look at labor and capital investment. Well, in the instance of hospitals, the biggest capital investment is beds, in other words, the facility, and the labor is the nursing staff and other staff. And then for outputs, we take surgical outpatient procedures, case mix adjusted admissions, etc. And these are all the sorts of outputs you would expect from a hospital. All right, here's a little bit of a description of the data. The major data sets have around 6,300 or so observations, hospital facilities. The number of those that across all years of our study provided sufficient or complete, the analysis requires complete information, was 2,849. So we got not quite half of all the hospitals were included. Just so you know, where are we losing hospitals? In our smaller and rural hospitals, so there is some bias in this analysis towards larger urban-based facilities. So what were the results of the efficiency analysis? Well, we see that total factor productivity had a mean of 1.0088 over the years studied. What does that mean? Well, in real terms, there was 88/100ths% increase in productivity each and every year of the study. So roughly a 1% increase in productivity across U.S. hospitals year in and year out. And that's a rather low number for many industries. We see bigger gains in things like airlines and manufacturing, but 1% is somewhat respectable. Then how do we see it decomposed? Well, if we look at efficiency change, that's where most of the gains are coming from. And here the mean of 1.0184 indicates that we're essentially getting more out of our existing systems versus the technological change. And you notice any number less than 1, which is unity, technical term, but it means that you actually aren't making your gains in terms of changes to your processes. So even though they're implementing electronic medical records and eLabs in particular, it's not influencing the underlying processes the way we would imagine. Then you can look at the results of our analysis writ large, where we actually do an ANOVA looking at efficiency, technological change, and total factor productivity in relationship to the eLAB taxonomy. And you'll notice the only really significant variable is total factor productivity, with efficiency change being somewhat significant. You have to go to the 0.1 level to accept that as being the major influence. So we see that eLabs are affecting the overall organization, but it's difficult to disaggregate to some extent what's really going on. Where they do seem to be more effective is in making what we do already operate more efficiently. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is duplication. So if it's not changing our culture, it's just making our system more efficient by taking out unnecessary duplication. This is consistent with that argument. We would expect to see that as a gain in efficiency, not a change in process or culture per se. So this is actually reconciling that this is probably making gains through the reduction of unnecessary testing, although we can't test that hypothesis directly. To go a little further into the analysis and look at the technology change taxonomy in particular, you'll notice I've highlighted two rows here. One is major progress, and remember, these are the people that jumped essentially 2 cells, or by a magnitude of about 50% increase in what they were doing, and they had the strongest positive change. And what does this indicate? Well, these people first have to have had essentially a simple implementation where they had it implemented, they tested it, they fixed what was wrong with it, and then they got on with it. In other words, they implement it, check it, and then they roll it out. So we go from simple to major. And they had the biggest gains in productivity, efficiency, and even in some of their technological changes, they're doing all right compared to some of the others. Where were the big losers in this? Well, Big Bang. What is the Big Bang? The Big Bang is going from 0 use to fully or 50% or more implemented. And we see that this is really detrimental to the overall productivity in the facility in the short term. And that's very troubling because eLabs, while it does touch on everything, it is not a system-wide activity per se. In other words, it touches a few people very heavily, but you wouldn't expect it to have this sort of effect, and it does. So we, prove our point that eLabs touch everything, but also how troubling it is that it can have this deleterious effect if implemented in this manner. So in the major results, hospitals were able to increase output to input ratio, but not underlying care processes. So they were increasing their efficiency largely by doing more with what they already had. The trade-off between efficiency and technological change, essentially these places are suffering a process setback in a respect, and this just could be the change process having negative impact, which it will, and that's interesting to see, and again consistent with what we would expect from most adoption theories. Big Bang seems to be particularly deleterious and something we probably wouldn't advise hospitals to use. Well, one thing that we know is that eLabs require rethinking job processes. If they're actually going to get further gains out of this, something has to happen in the underlying way things are carried out, although they will get some gains in just reducing duplication, it would appear. Limitations, as I mentioned earlier, we didn't have complete data on every hospital. Productivity gains for this period may not be representative of the entire sample. In other words, people who didn't adopt may have continued to enjoy higher productivity over time, and we weren't able to measure that. And we don't really include reimbursement information, which often plays a major role in hospitals. Thank you, and again, I'd like to thank my colleague there standing before you, Nir Shetri, and hope you have a good day and enjoy the rest of the conference. I look forward to seeing you next year in Kuala Lumpur.